very good actually, even though it got to the other side.
Okay guys, so we're going to get started. So before I start with the actual presentation, I just want to give you an overview of how this business breakfast will work. So I'm going to talk for about 15 minutes, just giving an introduction to human factors in industrial practice. 15-20 minutes. Then there'll be about 10 minutes for you guys to talk about safety and human factors in your own workplaces. And then the second half of the session, I'll give a quick overview of non-technical skills, and then we're going to be analysing a healthcare-based case study to see where the non-technical skills failures occurred. So what I'm going to talk about in this first section is I'm going to briefly define human factors, which, as most of you will probably already know, is a really broad topic area. Talk a little bit about human error, and then talk a little bit about how we can think about human factors from a system perspective, so thinking about the organisation as a whole. As I said, at the end of this part of the presentation, you will then get you to talk about human factors in your own workplace. So just start with a definition, and you can tell from this immediately how broad an area human factors is. So the health and safety executive definition of human factors is that human factors refer to environmental, organisational and job factors and human and individual characteristics which influence behaviour at work in a way that can affect health and safety. So we're thinking about environmental factors. This tends to refer to things like the temperature in the workplace, whether it's excessively hot or excessively cold, the level of noise, how well lit the workplace is, whether there's excessive vibration. Then we think about organisational factors. This might encompass things like safety climate, so the attitudes and beliefs of the workforce in terms of how important they feel safety is, the balance between safety and productivity. Also job factors, so things like relative workload, the level of time pressure that there might be, how well people are trained. And then human and individual characteristics. This can encompass everything from non-technical skills, which are things like teamwork, leadership and so on. Also how well we interact with others, whether we're experiencing conflict or arguments in the workplace. All of these elements can influence how we perform and act at work, and it can affect our health and safety. Human factors is also important to answer the why question. This is essentially when we are aware of adverse incidents such as aircraft crashes, train crashes, Deepwater Horizon, for example, so incidents offshore. We'll tend to analyse these incidents from a human factors perspective. So essentially we want to understand if errors happened, why did they occur, how did they occur, what can we do to try and prevent such errors from occurring in the future. An example of this is the Kegworth Air disaster. This was a crash of a Boeing 737 in 1989, which crashed near the M1 near Kegworth. Essentially, shortly after takeoff, the aircraft experienced a left engine malfunction. The left engine suffered from excessive vibration and eventually ended up going on fire and then not working at all. During the procedure of the incident, the crew ended up switching off the right-hand engine. So they switched off the only functioning engine that they had left. Why did they do that? Why did they behave in that way? What led up to that error occurring? Just to give you a brief overview from a human factors perspective, there were several elements that led to them feeling that it was the right-hand engine rather than the left-hand engine that was in trouble, that led them to then switch that engine off. So firstly, as context, this was the first time this crew had flown this version of the Boeing 737. So they were used to flying an older model, and that was their context that led to them having certain expectations as to where they should look for information and what certain cues meant. One of the primary cues that they thought meant that the right-hand engine was in trouble was smoke had entered the cockpit. Now, in the older version of the 737, bleed air was only taken from the right engine. So this is air drawn from the engine into the cockpit and the aircraft to provide freshening of air. So essentially, in the older model, if you had smoke in the cockpit, that meant that the right-hand engine was in trouble. In the new version, bleed air was taken from both engines, so smoke at that point was no longer a cue as to which engine was in trouble. However, in an emergency situation, the crew responded as if they were still flying the older model, so they thought that cue meant that the right-hand engine was in trouble. There were also design issues with the new cockpit. The vibration dials were much smaller and more difficult to read. In an emergency situation, they were essentially illegible, so the the crew couldn't get the information regarding vibration of the engines that they needed to see which one was in trouble. Dial positioning contradicted their mental model. Your mental model is how your actions interact with your workplace. In terms of an aircraft, this would be essentially where all of the dials and switches are for the operating the left-hand side of the aircraft, the right-hand side of the aircraft, information for the aircraft body, and so on. The dial positioning in the new cockpit meant that there was a mix of left and right-hand dials on both sides of the cockpit. So rather than all the dials that related to the left-hand side of the engine being on the left, and those on the right related to the right-hand side of the engine, they were mixed throughout. And again, in an emergency situation, this made it that much more difficult for the crew to find the information they needed related to which engine was in trouble. There was also a lack of an appropriate alarm system, so alarms were going off, but it wasn't specific enough to tell the crew which engine was in trouble. And finally, there were human behaviour elements as well. So for example, the cabin crew and the passengers could see that it was the left-hand engine that was on fire, but they didn't give this information to the cockpit crew, assuming that they would have get this information from the instruments that were in front of them. So you can start to get an idea how human error can occur and all of the different factors that can come together to lead to an adverse incident occurring. So when we're thinking about the workplace, we need to think about sort of three main areas. So we need to think about how the workplace is being designed. We need to recognise that the human cognitive and perceptual system isn't perfect. We have limitations in terms of our memory, in terms of how far we can spread our attention, in terms of how much information we can perceive accurately. We also need to think about the physiological and cognitive needs related to the temperature, the lighting level, the noise level in the workplace. We also need to think about how factors such as whether the workforce are fatigued from excessive workload, whether they're suffering from high levels of stress, whether they are in conflict with others, and how that might influence their safety and performance. We also need to think about the overall safety culture, so the attitude of the organisation towards safety and whether they are highlighting safety as being crucial or whether they are putting the emphasis on productivity, which might encourage work crews to take shortcuts. So when we're designing for safety, we need to think about perceptual limits. So all visual displays need to be legible. They need to utilise design features so that the critical information that worker needs to do their job safely and effectively is at the forefront and easy to perceive. Ideally, displays should match the movement and arrangement of objects and machinery in the environment so that the worker can have an intuitive interaction with their workplace. So they don't need to try and figure out in an illogical fashion what will happen if I switch this switch. It should be obvious and intuitive from the design of the workplace. We also need to think about attentional limits. We are very good at focusing on one particular area and looking at that area in a great amount of detail. We are less good when we have to switch tasks, so we have to go from one task to another frequently, or if we have to perceive a broad and complex visual display. We also need to think about memory. Essentially, we have memory limitations. We can't always hold a huge amount of information in our memory when we're doing our job, so we need to think about whether we can have memory cues or checklists so that all the information that a person needs is in the workplace so they don't have to rely on their memory alone. Any alarm systems are really an important and crucial aspect of the workplace, and they need to be informative. They need to tell the worker what's going on. They need to provide relevant information, and they need to encourage the worker to engage in the correct action to sort of deal with the situation. Main issues with alarms tend to be when you've got too many alarms, so you're flooded, so you've got so many alarms you can't tell which alarm you should be paying attention to. And false alarms, when you get an alarm which is giving you information that's not relevant to your task, and that tends to lead to the workers then ignoring future alarms. And finally, ideally, you want to allow for error recovery. So you want to accept that errors are likely to occur, and ideally the workers should be able to retrace their steps and recover from the error or minimise the outcome. So human error is essentially the failure of a planned action to achieve its goal, and this tends to have two main aspects, which tend to be slips, which are attentional failures. For example, we might be distracted and then carry out an incorrect action, or they tend to be lapses, which tend to be related to memory issues, so we might forget the step in a series of actions within a task. One of the best known models in this area is the Reason Swiss cheese model of error. This is taking a systematic view of errors that occur in the workplace. The idea is that every organisation will have safety barriers. These are elements that are put in place to try and minimise the likelihood of an error occurring. So this might be things like having appropriate safety equipment, making sure all of your staff are trained, making sure that visual displays are legible, and so on. However, within each of those barriers, there's likely to be a weakness. For example, we might have safety equipment, but perhaps we don't have enough safety equipment for all staff, or perhaps it is worn and tired equipment. We might have a legible display, but perhaps we're asking staff to work at night when it becomes less legible and more difficult to perceive. If these weaknesses line up, then a hazard can turn into a loss or an adverse incident. So we need to think about not only what the workers are doing, but all of the system-based factors that might influence their behaviour and might make an error more or less likely to occur. Within that, it's not always the fault of the human worker. So a human can be a hazard or a hero. So yes, workers can make mistakes, they can make errors. This tends to be related to systematic issues within the system, so lack of safety equipment, lack of training, and so on. But humans can also innovate and problem solve. So they can also take a system that might be faulty in some manner and problem solve to avoid errors from actually occurring. So it's not always about looking for where that humans have made a mistake. It might also be looking for where they've innovated, where they've problem solved, and how we can develop that. Within organisations, there tends to be error traps, and these are basically when a certain set of conditions tend to exist over time, so that no matter which worker is carrying out their job role, they're always more likely to make an error. This tends to be things like universal hazards. So, for example, in shipping and aviation, you have to take into account adverse weather conditions. You need to take into account the terrain. Local error traps and drivers. So local error traps tend to be things like excessive workload, having shifts with workers that have to work through the night. And drivers tend to be things like an excessive emphasis on productivity. So if you are pushing productivity, then workers are likely to take shortcuts. So this emphasis on productivity would be a driver for their behaviour. Identifying where errors have occurred is not the end of the investigation, it's the start. So we're not in the blame game. We are essentially looking to see what led up to that error occurring and how can we prevent that error from occurring in the future. So this is basically the comparison of a person versus a system approach. So the old style of human factors used to be very much a focus on the people who are on the front lines of an organisation, the people who are doing the job, and they would view accidents as being caused by that person being careless or not paying attention or negligent or taking a shortcut or what have you. And the way they would respond to those errors would be by taking disciplinary action. So essentially, you've made this error, it was your fault, we're going to fire you, end of problem. The new way, it's been around now for over a decade, so I guess it's not so new anymore, but the approved way is the system approach, where we look at the organisation as a whole. We look to see where the weaknesses, where the strengths, and what has led to errors occurring. So we don't blame the individual worker. We look at factors such as whether they had excessive workload, whether they were under time pressure, whether they were working at night, whether they were equipment failures, what led up to that error occurring. So our actions are looking at how safety barriers might have failed, looking at how we can implement training to improve things and make sure that workers are supported to improve and learn from the error. So we want to have a learning system. The last element I wanted to briefly cover before you guys talk about safety in your own workplace is this idea of safety culture. Safety culture, again, is sort of a broad umbrella term that refers to individual and group values, attitudes and beliefs and perceptions that determine the commitment to the style and proficiency of an organisation's health and safety management. So it's essentially the way we do things around here. It's the attitudes and beliefs of the workforce and the managers in terms of how important safety is, what have they put in place to make sure an organisation is safe, and how are they going to manage this into the future. Human factors, individuals assess this through safety climate. Safety climate is essentially a snapshot of safety culture. So we can assess attitudes and beliefs in terms of safety through questionnaires, interviews and so on. Safety climate has multiple components to it, not all of which I'm going to cover today, but some of the components you might want to think about in reference to your own workplace include managerial attitudes towards safety. Essentially, managers, particularly senior managers, they lead the charge in terms of safety within an organisation. So safety commitment definitely comes from the top and filters down through supervisors and then the workforce. So workers need to trust that managers will listen to any safety concerns, that they will respond to safety issues, and managers need to indicate through their own behaviours that they are committed to safety. And this will encourage the workers to believe that safety is important and is the primary commitment of the organisation. We also need to think about safety management systems. So what happens if an incident or a near miss occurs? What do the workers do about it? We want to encourage a reporting culture whereby workers feel happy and confident speaking up about errors, reporting them, reporting lapses, so that the organisation can learn from those and avoid errors going forward. Reporters should generally be protected from disciplinary action, so they feel that they are able and confident to report things and they're not going to be fired or lose their job as a consequence of that. You also need to think about risk management. So how do we assess risk within the workplace? How do we ensure that people can speak up if they see something going wrong? Something that we have to avoid within this element is avoiding groupthink. This is a case where essentially we tend to be impacted by peer pressure. So if everyone within our group is saying one thing, we won't necessarily feel confident to speak up and express a different opinion to everyone else. So it's really important that we have processes in place to avoid peer pressure and that everyone feels confident and able to speak up if a risky or dangerous scenario arises. And then we've got this production versus safety balance. So undue production pressure can lead to shortcuts and unsafe acts within the workplace. And essentially, by putting the emphasis on safety, we should accept that delays might happen and that rushing could compromise safety. And also, we should be happy and confident to halt work if necessary, if a dangerous situation is going to exist. So essentially, it's all about putting the emphasis on safety. Production is obviously an important part of any organisation from a profit point of view, but safety should be the primary concern, safety of the workforce. And the reason that it's so important to consider safety climate is that if we look at all of the major incidents such as Clapham Junction, which was a rail crash, Piper Alpha, Deepwater Horizon issues offshore, in each case, these were designated to be crisis-prone organisations, which meant that they had poor safety climate. So they had poor levels of commitment to safety, they had levels of management complacency, they didn't have good communication between and across teams, safety was considered to be a lower priority, they had poor safety equipment, they normalised risk-taking and shortcuts within the organisation. People weren't sure of whether they could speak up, who they should tell, or what they should do, whether there were issues within the organisation itself. So essentially, a poor safety climate could lead an organisation to experience an adverse incident, and so it's really important that it is emphasised. So that was sort of a quick breeze through human factors. So when we're thinking about human factors, we need to think about the person, their job, and the environment they work in, as well as the culture of the organisation. We need to accept that humans are fallible and that we have perceptual and cognitive limits, and that we can make mistakes, and we need to think about the factors leading to those issues and how we can avoid them. We need to take a system approach, so we're not looking to blame individuals, we're looking to look at the organisation as a whole. We want to try and design for safety, so designing and considering human limitations when we are putting together the workplace. We need to emphasise and think about safety climate, think about all of the attitudes towards safety within the organisation, and make sure that safety is the priority. So what I'd like you to do for the next sort of 10 minutes or so is just get to know your groups a little more, and just have a think about what you consider to be the main hazards or error traps or safety practices in either your workplace or workplaces that you have experience of. So it's really just thinking, what do you think are the main hazards? What do you do to avoid or manage those hazards? So you guys can all get started talking. Would you three be willing to come down and join these guys just so you can have more of a roundtable discussion? If you want another coffee or whatever, feel free to grab one now before you all start talking. So we'll take about 10 minutes and then I'll do your presentation.